When the letter from the school arrived, it wasn't really a letter at all. It was a folded piece of glossy paper, printed in bright colors with tents and smiling fathers and sons, marshmallows on sticks and bold letters that read, Annual Father-Son Camp Weekend, build memories that last a lifetime. I held that flyer in my hands longer than I should have, longer than most fathers probably did. For them, it was just another event to add to their calendar, one more outing in the stream of soccer practices, piano recitals, and neighborhood barbecues. For me, it was a chance. You see, when you're in your late 50s pushing into your 60s, the chances you get with your son don't come around often. They used to be endless: afternoons at the park, late nights building model cars, mornings where he'd crawl into my lap just to tell me about a dream. But somewhere between middle school and high school, the chances dwindled down into something rare and fragile. Now my son Ben was 16, tall, with that impatient way of walking teenagers get, as if the world is always one step behind them. He had friends I didn't know by name, music that sounded more like static to me, and a phone glued to his hand. I wasn't naive. I knew I didn't fit into his world the way I once did. But when I saw that flyer, I thought maybe, just maybe, I could slip back in for a weekend. So I circled the dates in red on the kitchen calendar and told him at dinner. He barely looked up from his plate. "Camp," he said, as if I'd suggested we go dig ditches for fun. "Yeah," I said. "Father-son thing, couple of days in the woods, fishing, campfires, maybe a little hiking." He shrugged the way teenagers shrug, which somehow holds a whole dictionary of meanings. "I don't care, I care too much, I'm embarrassed, I'm tired. I'm scared you'll notice how much this actually matters to me." "Sure," he said finally, stabbing his fork into a piece of chicken. "Whatever." That whatever was all I needed. When the day came, I packed my old duffel. Other fathers probably filled theirs with sleeping bags from sporting goods stores, pre-packed camping kits, sleek lanterns you charge with USB ports. I packed tools. Not the shiny, compact kind that come in plastic cases. No, these were the old ones. A hammer with a wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. A saw that had cut more than its share of planks. A battered tin box of nails that rattled when you shook it. Pliers, a level rope, a folding carpenter's square. Ben watched me pack from the kitchen doorway. He leaned against the frame with his arms crossed, eyebrows pinched together. "Why are you bringing all that?" "Tools," I said simply. He rolled his eyes. "Dad, it's camping. People bring, tents, sleeping bags, food." "I've got food," I said, showing him the cooler of sandwiches and fruit. "And a sleeping bag." "Yeah, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head like I was some ancient relic dug up and dusted off. I wanted to explain it to him, to say, "Son, sometimes the best way to build memories isn't with gadgets or shiny things you buy in stores. It's with your hands, with sweat and time, and the kind of work you can point to when it's done and say that's ours." But I didn't say it. I just smiled and zipped the duffel shut. The drive to camp was quiet. He had earbuds in, staring out the window, and I didn't press him. When we turned off the highway onto a narrow road lined with tall pines, I caught my own reflection in the glass, gray at the temples, lines around the eyes, the kind of face you see on men who have worked with their hands their whole lives. I thought about my father, his hands always scarred from carpentry jobs, his back bent but his pride tall. He used to say, "A man leaves something behind, not just in people but in things he's made." When we pulled into the campground, the parking lot was already full. SUVs and shiny trucks, fathers unloading coolers, tents that popped up like magic from bags, foldable chairs in bright colors, propane grills. The air was alive with chatter and laughter. I slung my duffel onto my shoulder and felt the weight of the tools clank against each other. Heads turned. I caught a couple of dads exchanging smirks. One even chuckled under his breath. Ben noticed too. He stiffened beside me. "Dad," he muttered. "Seriously." "Seriously," I said, and kept walking. We registered at the camp table, got our map, and headed toward our assigned spot. Most of the fathers and sons were already setting up, poles snapping together, nylon tents rising like balloons. Some had those massive tents with separate rooms, big enough for a family of 6. We reached our little patch of grass and dirt under the pines. Ben dropped his backpack and looked at me expectantly. "So, where's the tent?" he asked. I opened the duffel, the smell of old wood and iron drifting up. I pulled out the hammer. He groaned. "Oh my God!" Around us, laughter spilled out again. I heard one father say to another, "Guess someone forgot what century we're in." Another chuckled. "Hope he doesn't start building a log cabin." Ben's ears burned red. He turned away, pretending to check his phone. And me, I just gripped that hammer a little tighter, let the weight of it steady me. I know some of you watching this or listening to my story, you've been there. Maybe not with a hammer and nails, but with something you carried into a room that made everyone else laugh. Maybe it was your accent, or your clothes, or your ideas. Maybe it was the way you loved your kids too openly when others thought it was uncool. If you've ever been laughed at for the way you love, then stick with me through this story, because I promise you, it doesn't end with the laughter. And if you're the kind of person who believes that sometimes the old ways still have a place in the new world, well, you're in the right place. So while you're here, do me a favor. Hit that like button if you've ever felt out of place but kept going anyway. And subscribe if you believe family stories, real ones, still matter in a world full of noise. Because what happened at that camp, what I built, what my son and I found together, it changed everything. And it all started with that hammer in my hand and a dozen people laughing behind my back. The sound of laughter doesn't always come in big waves. Sometimes it's quiet, tucked between words like a cough trying to disguise itself. Sometimes it's the tilt of a head, the narrowing of an eye, or the slight smirk at the corner of someone's mouth. I felt all of it that first afternoon. I wasn't an unfamiliar sight at the school. I'd been the dad who fixed the broken bench on the playground one spring, the one who hammered the loose steps behind the gym. I was the man who showed up with calloused hands while other parents arrived with store-bought donations. I never thought of myself as out of place. But in that campground, with my duffel of tools instead of sleek tents, I may as well have been wearing overalls at a black-tie dinner. Ben kept his distance from me, fiddling with his phone, but I could see him stealing glances at the other fathers. They were dressed in crisp outdoor gear, hiking boots that still looked brand new, hats with expensive brand logos. They laughed easily, swapped stories about vacations to resorts or ski trips. And then there was me, kneeling in the dirt, pulling out a rope that had frayed edges, trying to find a good tree branch to anchor it to. One father passed by, carrying a cooler so big it looked like it could store half a cow. He smiled at me, but it wasn't kindness. It was that thin smile that says, "I'm amused at you, not with you." "Planning on building a fort?" he asked. "Something like that," I replied. He chuckled, shook his head, and moved on. Dinner that night was worse. The camp provided a communal fire pit for those who didn't want to cook, but many fathers brought their own grills and setups. The air smelled like sizzling burgers, seasoned chicken, hot dogs roasting on sticks. Fathers handed their sons plates piled with food, soda cans cracked open with the hiss of carbonation. I opened my cooler and pulled out what I had packed: ham sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a container of potato salad, a small bag of apples. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't meant to be. Ben looked at it and sighed. "Seriously, Dad," he whispered, glancing at his friend Jacob, who was sitting nearby with a full plate of barbecue. "What?" I asked. "It's food." "Yeah, but it's—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. I knew the rest of the sentence anyway. "It's embarrassing." So we ate quietly, just the two of us on our patch of dirt, while laughter and smoke and music drifted over from the other families. Ben barely touched his sandwich. I finished mine slowly, chewing each bite like it was heavier than it should have been. When the sun went down, campfires lit up the clearing. Fathers told stories, some exaggerated for effect, some so rehearsed they felt like they'd been saving them for this moment. Kids laughed, roasting marshmallows, their faces glowing in the firelight. I sat back on a log, my son beside me, and listened. Not to their stories, but to the silence between mine and his. It's a strange thing being a father. You spend years trying to teach your child how to walk, how to talk, how to ride a bike, how to tie his shoes. And then one day, without warning, you realize the lessons have changed. You're no longer teaching the basics of survival. You're teaching him how to see you. And that night I could tell Ben saw me as less. He saw the laughter, the sandwiches, the worn tools. He saw me not fitting in. And part of him, the part that wanted to belong to the noise and the firelight, wished he had a different father just for that weekend. The thought cut deeper than I care to admit. Later, when most of the fathers and sons had retreated into their tents, I sat awake on the log. My sleeping bag lay unrolled beside me, the rope I'd half-heartedly tied earlier drooping between two trees. Ben was already asleep, turned away from me, his breathing steady. I stared at the stars. They were bright that night, scattered like nails across a dark plank. My father used to say the stars were God's way of showing us that light can still punch holes in the deepest dark. I thought about the flyer again, build memories that last a lifetime. Was this what they meant? A boy embarrassed of his father, a father trying too hard, laughter ringing in the background like nails tapping on wood. I could have given up then, packed up my tools, pitched a simple tent and blended in. No one would have laughed anymore. Ben might have even breathed a sigh of relief. But something inside me, the same something that kept me working long nights in my garage, repairing old furniture just because I believed broken things deserved another chance, that something whispered, no, don't stop here. The next morning I rose before dawn. The camp was quiet, dew glistening on the grass, smoke from last night's fires hanging low like ghosts. I walked to the edge of the woods, breathing in the smell of pine and damp earth, and I made a decision. If they thought I was here with my tools for no reason, they were wrong. If they thought laughter would stop me, they didn't know the first thing about me. I wasn't going to build a tent. I was going to build a home. Not a permanent one, of course, but something real, something sturdy. Something my son could step into and say, my father made this with his own hands. I pictured it in my mind, walls of branches, a roof sloped with pine boughs, a doorway wide enough for the two of us to walk through together. It wouldn't be polished, it wouldn't be perfect, but it would stand. I returned to our spot, picked up my hammer and began. The first strike echoed through the quiet morning, a sharp metallic thud against wood. Birds startled from nearby branches. My hands felt alive again, as if the years had fallen off and I was a younger man building something that mattered. Ben stirred in his sleeping bag, groggy, confused. "Dad, what are you doing?" he mumbled. "Building," I said simply. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and frowned. "Everyone's gonna laugh." "Let them," I said, raising the hammer again. By mid-morning, fathers emerged from their tents. They watched me curiously, some shaking their heads, some chuckling. One even muttered loud enough for me to hear, "Guess he's serious about that log cabin." Ben pulled his hoodie over his head as if hiding from the scene. My heart tightened, but I didn't stop, because sometimes the only way to teach your son strength is to show him what it looks like when the world tries to weaken you. And that was the beginning. The laughter was still there, but so was I, and I had no intention of stopping. If you want to know how far apart a father and son can feel, don't look at the big things. Don't look at the arguments about curfews or grades, or the way voices rise when patience runs thin. Look instead at the quietest moments, the times you're supposed to be closest. A shared meal, for example. The next morning after I'd started my so-called project, the campground was alive with the smell of breakfast. Fathers were already gathered around portable stoves, frying bacon that crackled in the pans. Some had coolers that seemed to produce food endlessly, pancake mix, syrup, cartons of orange juice. The boys circled like hungry wolves, laughing, grabbing plates, comparing what their dads had brought. I opened my cooler. Inside, things were simpler. Hard-boiled eggs wrapped in napkins, bread for toasting over an open flame, a jar of peanut butter, a little tin of salt. It was what I had always considered enough. Food that filled your stomach, gave you energy, got you through the day. Ben stared at it, his face a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. "Dad," he said, "everyone else has, like, real food." "This is real food," I answered, peeling an egg with fingers that still ached from yesterday's hammering. "Protein, Carbs, it'll keep us going. He glanced over his shoulder at his friend Jacob, whose father was serving steaming plates of pancakes stacked so high they looked like towers. Butter melted over the edges, syrup dripping down like golden rivers. Jacob caught Ben's eye and grinned. Ben looked down, cheeks pink. Couldn't we have just brought something like that? I shrugged. I don't have a pancake griddle, but I do have these. I held up the eggs like they were treasures. He groaned. You don't get it. Maybe I didn't, or maybe I did too well. We sat on a log and ate quietly. Around us, kids laughed with their mouths full, syrup on their chins. Fathers poured coffee into stainless steel mugs, clinking them together like toasts. The smell of bacon drifted across the camp, rich and heavy, and our little breakfast of bread and eggs felt small. Ben took a single bite of toast and put it down. I'm not really hungry. Eat, I urged. You'll need it. He folded his arms. I said I'm not hungry. I let it go. Sometimes forcing a boy only drives him further away. So I finished my own food, chewing each bite slowly, listening to the sounds around me that weren't ours. The laughter, the clatter of plates, the easy conversations of fathers who seemed to know exactly how to belong. I could feel the invisible wall between me and Ben. A wall built not of wood or nails, but of embarrassment. Later that day, activities began. There were team games, three-legged races, canoeing competitions, even a talent show some of the boys were planning for the campfire that night. Fathers cheered for their sons, slapped each other on the back, made jokes loud enough for everyone to hear. I tried to cheer for Ben the same way. When he paddled in the canoe race, I clapped until my palms stung. But I noticed the way he flinched when I shouted his name, as if my voice carried the wrong kind of weight. Other fathers' cheers made their sons beam. Mine only made him row faster, eyes down, shoulders stiff. When his canoe tipped and he came out dripping wet, laughter erupted. Harmless, good-natured laughter, but Ben looked at me first as if my reaction mattered most. I smiled, offered him a towel. Happens to the best of us. He didn't take it. He walked past me, head low, muttering, "Just stop, Dad." That night, when the communal dinner came around, it was worse than breakfast. The smell of grilled steaks filled the air. Some fathers had packed coolers like they were hosting a feast for kings. Corn on the cob roasted over flames, foil packets of seasoned potatoes hissed in the embers. The boys gathered in circles, plates balanced on their laps, talking about whose dad was the best cook. I opened my cooler again. The sandwiches I'd packed for dinner were still there, slightly damp from the ice. Ham and cheese on white bread, nothing more. Ben saw them and shut his eyes tight, like the sight alone was too much. "Dad, seriously." "What?" I asked. "It's food." "Yeah, but it's—" He didn't finish, but I knew the word again. Embarrassing. He sat a little further away from me, closer to Jacob and the others. I watched him laugh at jokes I couldn't hear, take bites of steak offered from another father's plate. He didn't touch the sandwich I set next to him. I ate mine alone. There's a silence fathers carry. It isn't the silence of ignorance or not knowing what to say. It's the silence of knowing too much, of realizing that anything you speak will only widen the gap. I chewed my sandwich and looked at the faces glowing in the firelight, fathers, sons together, and I wondered if Ben wished he belonged to one of them instead. It's a cruel thought, but one that sneaks in when your child looks at you with eyes that say, "Why can't you be like them?" But here's the thing, I wasn't like them, and I wasn't about to start pretending. That night, when Ben slipped into his sleeping bag, he faced away from me again. The moonlight came through the trees, painting silver lines across the ground. I lay awake, listening to the distant hum of voices fading as other camps quieted down. I thought of my own father again, how he never once bought me something shiny just to keep me from feeling left out, how he gave me his time instead, his sweat, his patience, his calloused hands guiding mine. I remembered the first chair we built together, crooked, uneven, one leg shorter than the others, but I'd sat in it proudly because it wasn't about the chair. It was about him and me, side by side, creating something. I turned on my side, looked at my son's back, his shoulders rising and falling with sleep, and I wondered if he'd ever feel that way with me, or if I was too late. The laughter from earlier still echoed in my ears. The comparisons, the glances, the way he'd leaned away from me. But deep down, beneath the ache, a small ember of determination glowed. They could laugh at me all they wanted. They could call me old-fashioned, outdated, embarrassing. But before this camp was over, I was going to build something my son would never forget. The second night at camp, after the fire had died down and most fathers had zipped themselves into their tents, I sat awake again. My back leaned against a tree, my hands folded loosely across my lap. Ben was asleep, though even in sleep he seemed turned away from me, as if embarrassment followed him into dreams. The sky was wide and scattered with stars. Pines whispered in the breeze. Somewhere an owl called. And that's when it struck me. Not like a bolt of lightning, but like a slow dawn creeping over a horizon you didn't know you'd been waiting for. I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep showing up with half measures and hoping they would fill the space between us. If I wanted Ben to remember this weekend, not as a collection of small humiliations, but as something alive, something proud, then I had to do more than survive it. I had to build something. I looked at the tools laid out by the duffel, the hammer, the saw, the nails rattling in their tin box. My fingers brushed across them the way a musician touches strings before a song. A tent wouldn't do, not for me, not for us. I decided we were going to have a cabin. The next morning, dew clung to the grass and sunlight filtered through the branches in long golden stripes. Fathers were already stirring, pouring coffee, their laughter low and lazy. Ben rubbed his eyes and sat up. He saw me kneeling by the tools, already sketching in the dirt with a stick lines, squares, angles that only made sense to me. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice groggy but edged with suspicion. I smiled. "Planning. For what? For something better than a tent." He blinked, then frowned. "You don't mean—" "Exactly," I said. "We're going to build ourselves a cabin." He stared at me like I just said we'd fly to the moon with duct tape and a ladder. "Dad, no, no way. Everyone's gonna laugh even more. It's crazy." I leaned on the stick like it was a cane, looked him square in the eye. "Ben, people already laugh. That part doesn't change. What can change is what we do with it." He shook his head, pulling his hoodie tighter around him. "I just want a normal camp weekend. Why can't you be like the other dads?" The words landed heavier than he intended. But I didn't flinch. "Because I'm not the other dads," I said softly. "And neither are you." By mid-morning, I began collecting branches, scanning the forest floor for ones thick and long enough to serve as beams. My hands were steady, my pace deliberate. Each piece I dragged back felt like the beginning of a wall. Ben trailed behind me, his face a storm of emotions, confusion, embarrassment, a flicker of something else he tried to hide. "Dad, seriously," he muttered. "This is going to be a disaster. We don't even have the stuff for it. We've got wood, we've got tools, we've got time." "Yeah, but you don't know how long that'll take. Everyone else is just having fun." I stopped, turned to him. "Do you think this isn't fun for me?" He looked startled, like he hadn't thought of it that way. "I don't want marshmallows and folding chairs," I said. "I want to leave this weekend with something we can point to and say, that's ours, we made it." He scowled, but his silence said more than words. He wasn't convinced, but he wasn't leaving either. Around us, the camp buzzed with curiosity. Fathers nudged each other, smirking, pointing in my direction. Some made jokes loud enough for me to hear. "Looks like he's setting up for a construction site. Maybe he'll charge us rent. Hope he's got a building permit." The laughter rose and fell like waves on a shore. I drove the first nail into a crossbeam. The metallic crack rang through the trees, sharp, defiant. It silenced a few chuckles for a moment before they resumed again. Ben buried his hands in his pockets, cheeks red. "Dad, stop, please, you're making it worse." I rested the hammer on my thigh, looked at him with steady eyes. "Son, one day you'll learn something important. Worse for them doesn't always mean worse for you. Sometimes the thing people laugh at is the very thing you'll carry proudly when the laughter's gone." He shook his head, frustrated. "You always have to make everything weird." "Maybe weird is just another word for worth remembering," I replied. That night, while others sat by the fire trading stories, I kept working by the dim light of a lantern. The wood creaked, nails groaned as they sank in, and slowly, very slowly, the skeleton of a cabin began to emerge. Two upright posts, a beam across the top. Rough, imperfect, but undeniably real. Ben sat nearby, arms wrapped around his knees, torn between wanting to walk away and not wanting to miss what came next. "Why do you care so much about this?" he asked finally. His voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the crackling fire from other camps. I paused, hammer midair. "Because when I was your age, my father built our porch from nothing, just wood, nails, and his two hands. He made a place where we sat together every evening. It wasn't just boards and nails. It was time. It was presence." I set the hammer down and looked at him. "This cabin isn't just wood, Ben. It's my way of saying I'm here for you, always." For the first time, he didn't roll his eyes. He didn't smirk. He just looked at me, lips parted like he wanted to say something but couldn't. And that silence felt more powerful than any laughter around us. The work wasn't easy. My hands blistered, my back ached, sweat dripped down my temples even in the cool night air. But every strike of the hammer felt like a heartbeat, steady, alive. And though my son still carried his embarrassment like a shield, I could see it shifting. Each time he glanced at the posts rising from the ground, something softened. Curiosity, respect maybe, or at least the beginning of it. I knew the road ahead would be harder. The laughter would grow. The doubts would whisper louder. But the decision was made. We weren't here to camp. We were here to build. The thing about laughter is that it carries. You can be 20 yards away, hammer in hand, sawdust at your knees, and you'll still hear it slicing through the air as if it were meant only for you. That morning I was bent over a piece of wood, sawing it into shape. The rhythm was steady, back and forth, the teeth biting into the grain, singing their old familiar song. To me it sounded like progress. To them it must have sounded like comedy. "Look at that," one father said, his voice not even lowered. "Guys trying to build a house out here." Another chuckled. "What's next? Plumbing? Maybe he'll run us electricity too." The group around him laughed, the kind of laughter that isn't cruel enough to start a fight but sharp enough to cut just the same. I kept sawing. But I didn't need to turn around to know Ben was standing stiff beside me, face burning, wishing the earth would open up and swallow him whole. "Dad," he hissed under his breath. We're all staring. "Let them," I murmured, eyes fixed on the cut. "Can't you just stop, please? We could still put up a tent, just be normal for once." The words "be normal" landed like a stone in my chest. Normal, as if what I was wasn't enough. I swallowed hard and set the saw down, not because I wanted to stop, but because I needed to look at him. His eyes darted anywhere but mine, flicking nervously to where his friends were watching from a distance. "I know this is hard on you," I said softly. "I know it feels like the whole camp is laughing, but son, sometimes you've got to decide what's louder, their laughter or your own heart." He groaned, dragging a hand over his face. "Why do you always have to say stuff like that? Can't you just camp like everyone else?" I didn't answer. Some questions aren't meant to be answered in words, only in time. By noon, I had 4 posts upright, lashed together with rope. It was the skeleton of something, still fragile, still awkward, but unmistakably the beginning of walls. A few boys wandered over, curiosity outweighing mockery. "Is that like a cabin?" one asked. "Looks more like a playground," another giggled. Their fathers called them back, not wanting them too close to my construction site. I heard one mutter, "Don't want him thinking that's how real camping's done." Real camping. I pressed a nail against the wood, raised the hammer. Each strike rang out like punctuation against their words. Bang, bang, bang. Ben had retreated to the edge of our little patch, kicking at pine needles with his sneaker. Every so often he shot me a look of sheer misery, the kind of look that said, "You're ruining me." And maybe in his teenage mind I was. But I wasn't building this for the fathers or for their approval. I wasn't even building it for myself. I was building it for him, though he couldn't see it yet. By late afternoon, the comments had grown bolder. Fathers passed by in small groups, sometimes pausing just long enough to shake their heads. "Going all little house on the prairie, huh? Bet he thinks he's a pioneer. Should have brought him a bonnet instead of a backpack." Laughter followed each remark like a trail of smoke. Ben's fists clenched at his sides. He walked over, voice low and sharp. "I can't do this, Dad. I can't be the kid with the crazy father. Do you get that? Everyone's laughing at me too." I laid the hammer down, wiped sweat from my brow, and looked at him. Really looked. His jaw tight, his eyes bright with humiliation, but underneath fear. Fear of being different, fear of standing too close to me and catching the arrows meant for my back. I know, I said quietly. I know it feels unbearable. But son, listen to me. Sometimes the things that embarrass you today will be the very things you thank me for tomorrow. He shook his head violently. You don't get it, you never get it. Then he stormed off toward the games field where other boys were tossing a football. He didn't look back. I stood alone beside the half-born frame of the cabin. My shirt clung with sweat, my palms stung from splinters, and my heart ached with the echo of his words. It would have been easy to stop then. Easy to pack it all up, retreat into the safe anonymity of a nylon tent, pretend this had never been my plan. It would have spared him embarrassment. It would have spared me the stares. But I didn't pick up the hammer because it was easy. I picked it up because it was necessary. I thought of my father again, bent over that porch in the heat of summer, neighbors shaking their heads at the uneven beams, at the old man who insisted on building it himself instead of hiring help. And I remembered how, every night after supper, we'd sit on that crooked porch together. How I'd rest my head against his shoulder, feeling the rough fabric of his work shirt, the smell of sawdust still clinging to him. No one remembers the neighbor's laughter. I only remember him. So I raised the hammer again. As evening settled in, the cabin's frame grew sturdier. A roofline suggested itself, crude but promising. My muscles trembled with fatigue, but my spirit held steady. Some fathers had grown quiet now, no longer laughing, though smirks still lingered. Others still found their jokes. Guess he's serious. Hope he brought a realtor. Their words fell around me like leaves. I didn't bother brushing them away. The lantern burned late into the night, casting long shadows across the beams. Alone I worked, sweat dripping, nails bending, rope straining. And though my son's laughter wasn't among the campfire songs, I carried a stubborn faith. One day he'd see what I was really building. Not just walls, not just a roof, but a memory strong enough to outlast their laughter. The laughter didn't stop, not entirely. By the third day it had become part of the soundtrack of the camp. The thud of my hammer, the scrape of my saw, and somewhere in the distance, the chuckle of another father who thought I was out of my mind. But that morning, as I bent to tie a beam into place, the laughter seemed further away. What I heard most was the crunch of sneakers in pine needles. Ben's sneakers. He walked up quietly, his steps hesitant, as though each one was a decision. Stopped just behind me. I could feel the heat of his silence before he spoke. "Dad," he whispered. I paused, rope in hand, waiting. "Please stop." His voice cracked slightly, not loud enough for others to hear, but loud enough to pierce me straight through. "They won't stop laughing, and I can't take it anymore. I'm the one who has to sit with them, eat with them. They look at me like I'm the kid with the weird dad." The words hurt, not because they were cruel, but because they were true to him. In his 16-year-old world, reputation was currency. Belonging was survival, and here I was, bankrupting him with every swing of the hammer. I turned, wiping sweat from my brow, and met his eyes. They were glossy, though he'd never admit to tears. His jaw was tight, shoulders hunched as if bracing for me to argue. "Ben," I said softly, I know you're embarrassed. I know it feels like I'm making you carry something heavy in front of everyone, and maybe I am." He looked down, scuffing the dirt with his shoe. "But son," I continued, "one day you'll learn something. People will always laugh at what they don't understand. What matters is what you build in spite of it." He shook his head fiercely. "You don't get it. I don't care about building. I care about not being laughed at. I just want to fit in for once." The words hit me harder than any hammer swing. I thought of all the times I had wanted to fit in, too. The school dances I never attended because I couldn't afford the right clothes. The neighborhood gatherings where my father's truck looked shabby next to polished cars. I remembered wishing he would just blend in just once. But when I grew older, I realized something. He hadn't been trying to blend. He had been trying to stand. I stepped closer, rested a hand on Ben's shoulder. He tensed but didn't pull away. "Ben," I whispered, "this isn't about fitting in. It's about standing up. For who you are, for where you come from, for what you can make with your own two hands. This cabin, it's not just wood, it's a piece of me I'm trying to give to you." He looked at me then, really looked. For a second his defenses cracked. His eyes flickered with something, confusion, maybe curiosity, maybe a tiny shard of belief. "Why does it have to be so hard?" he muttered. "Because the things worth remembering usually are," I said. For the rest of that morning, he lingered nearby. He didn't help, not yet, but he didn't walk away either. He sat on a log, arms crossed, pretending not to watch. Every time I lifted the hammer, I could feel his eyes flick toward me, then away. At one point, another father walked past with his son, shaking his head. "Still at it, huh?" he called. "Still at it," I replied without looking up. When they passed, I noticed Ben's posture shift. He wasn't proud yet, but he wasn't shrinking either. Something was changing. That evening, as the campfire blazed in the clearing, kids roasted marshmallows on sticks. The smell of sugar and smoke hung heavy in the air. Ben sat a few feet away from me, laughing weakly at a joke Jacob told. But his eyes kept drifting back to our half-built cabin frame, lit faintly by the lantern I'd left burning. When the fire died down and the crowd scattered to their tents, he walked back with me. Neither of us spoke until we reached our spot. "Dad," he said quietly. "Yes." He hesitated, shoving his hands into his hoodie pocket. I don't get why you care so much about this, about building, about being different." I looked at the frame silhouetted against the moonlight. "Because when you're my age, son, you realize that the things people laughed at were the only things worth remembering. No one remembers the tents. They'll remember this." He was silent for a long time. Then he said, almost too soft to hear, "What if I don't want to remember it?" The question sliced deeper than he knew. I took a breath, steadied my voice. "Then maybe one day when you're older you will, even if it takes years, even if it takes me being gone. You'll remember, and it'll mean something then." He didn't answer, but he didn't walk away either. He sat beside me on the log, the closest he'd been in days. And for a moment the silence between us wasn't heavy. It was almost comfortable. Later that night, after he fell asleep, I stayed awake watching him. His face was softer in sleep, his brow smooth, his lips slightly parted. He didn't look like a boy embarrassed by his father. He looked like the child I once carried on my shoulders, the boy who used to ask me to tell him bedtime stories about heroes who built kingdoms with nothing but courage and stone. And I realized I wasn't just building a cabin. I was trying to remind him that heroes don't come from fitting in. They come from standing out, even if the world laughs first. So I picked up the hammer again, the lantern throwing long shadows, and I kept building into the night. Because somewhere under all that embarrassment, my son had whispered the truth. He didn't understand yet, but he would. One day. The days that followed blurred into the sound of nails and the ache of muscles. Each morning I rose before the others, before the smoke of their fires curled into the sky, before the laughter began. I tied rope, lifted beams, sawed until my arms shook. By noon, blisters had opened across my palms, raw and angry. The hammer left crescents in my skin. At night, I fell asleep against unfinished walls, my body heavy as stone. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't quick either. While other fathers spent their hours fishing or laughing over coffee, I was bent over wood, sweat soaking my shirt. They returned from hikes with their sons, snapping photos on smartphones while I squinted against the sun trying to line a crooked beam. And still, the laughter came. Not as sharp as before. Mockery tends to dull when it has to repeat itself, but steady like a background hum. A joke here, a smirk there. Sometimes I caught a boy mimicking me, pretending to swing an invisible hammer, and his friends doubled over. But the strange thing was, I minded less with every passing day, because while they laughed, the cabin grew. Slowly, stubbornly, but undeniably. Ben kept his distance at first. He joined in the camp games, tried to blend into the crowd, but I could see the way his eyes drifted back to me when he thought no one was watching. One afternoon, as I wiped sweat from my forehead with a rag, I caught him sitting on a nearby log watching me work. He didn't say anything, just sat, arms on his knees, face unreadable. "You're still here," I said without looking up. He shrugged. "Just resting." I drove another nail, the beam groaned but held. "Fair enough." For a while, the only sounds were the rhythmic thud of the hammer and the rustling of leaves overhead. Then he asked quietly, "Doesn't it hurt?" I glanced at my hands. They were raw, small beads of blood forming at the base of a blister. I flexed my fingers, wincing. "Yes," I said honestly. "Then why keep going?" His voice wasn't mocking anymore, it was curious, maybe even concerned. I set the hammer down and sat beside him on the log. For a moment I just breathed, letting the cool shade touch my skin. "When I was your age," I began, "my father, your grandpa, built our porch with his bare hands. Every evening after work he'd come home, wipe the sweat from his brow, and keep hammering until the sun went down. His hands bled too. His back ached, but he kept going." Ben looked at me sideways. "Why?" "Because he wanted something solid for us. A place to sit together, a place to belong. That porch wasn't perfect, it leaned a little to the left, the paint never quite stuck, but every night we'd sit there side by side. And I knew no matter how hard the world was, that porch was ours. That's what he gave me, not just wood, not just nails, time, presence." Ben didn't respond right away. He stared at the dirt, scuffing it with his sneaker. Then he said, barely above a whisper, "I don't remember him." I swallowed. "You were too young, but he'd have loved to see you. He'd have been proud." His face softened just for a moment, and in that moment I saw the boy who used to climb into my lap asking for stories, the boy who once believed my hands could build anything. The next day he came back again. This time he didn't sit as far. "You should wrap your hands," he muttered, glancing at the bandages I'd haphazardly tied. "Good idea," I said. He didn't say more, but he didn't leave either. He lingered while I sawed, sometimes handing me nails without being asked. Small gestures, quiet as whispers. By the third day he was holding one of the beams steady while I hammered it in place. He kept his head down as if helping me was a secret, but his grip was firm. "Straight," I said. "Hold it straight." "I am," he replied. I smiled. "You are." That evening, as the firelight painted the camp in orange glow, I caught him telling Jacob about his grandfather. "My dad said he built their porch all by himself," Ben said almost casually. "Like every night after work, didn't quit until it was done." Jacob raised his eyebrows. "Seriously?" "Yeah," Ben nodded. "Guess that's where he gets it from." He said it like an explanation, like he was beginning to understand. And I sat a little straighter, my chest warm, not from the fire, but from the sound of my son telling someone else my story, as if it mattered. The work was still hard. My muscles still screamed. The laughter hadn't died completely, but something had shifted. When I swung the hammer now, I wasn't just building walls. I was building a bridge back to my son. Every blister, every drop of sweat, every aching joint, it was the price of that bridge. And it was worth it, because slowly, painfully, beautifully, he was crossing it. The morning sun came through the pines in streaks of gold, painting the unfinished frame of our cabin like some half-forgotten cathedral. I was on my knees, driving a nail into place when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't look up. I assumed it was another father passing by, maybe ready with another joke. But then I heard a voice I hadn't expected. "Here," Ben said. I turned. He was holding the hammer. For a moment I just stared, as if my brain couldn't quite catch up with what my eyes were seeing. His fingers wrapped around the handle, awkward but determined. His face was set serious with just the faintest tremor of nervousness. "You can't hold it like that," I said gently. He frowned. "Then show me." And just like that, something shifted. I stood, brushing sawdust from my jeans, and placed my hand over his. "Grip it firm, but not like you're strangling it. Let it move with you, not against you." He nodded, jaw tight, as if determined not to let me see how much this mattered to him. "Now," I said, holding the nail steady against the beam, "don't think about the whole cabin, just think about this one nail, one swing at a time." He raised the hammer, hesitated, then brought it down. The nail bent sideways. "Ugh," he groaned, frustration flashing across his face. I chuckled softly. "First time I ever swung one, I bent 3 in a row. Try again." He straightened the nail, adjusted his grip, and tried once more. This time it sank a little deeper. A third swing drove it nearly flush. He pulled back, breathless. "I did it." "You did," I said, clapping him lightly on the shoulder. "And tomorrow you'll do it better." For the rest of that morning he stayed with me. He fetched nails, steadied beams, even tried sawing under my watchful eye. He was clumsy, of course, his cuts weren't straight, his swings uneven, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that he was here, with me. Every strike of his hammer sounded different from mine, less certain, less steady, but together they made a rhythm. A rhythm of two hearts beating in sync after too long out of step. At one point he asked, "How do you know where to put everything? There aren't any instructions." I smiled. Some things don't come with instructions, you just trust what feels right. Wood has a way of telling you how it wants to fit together. He gave me a skeptical look. That sounds kind of weird. Maybe, I said. But sometimes people are like wood too. They look stiff, unyielding, but if you listen closely, you'll know how they fit into your life. He rolled his eyes, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch like he was hiding a smile. That afternoon, as other fathers lounged in camp chairs, sipping sodas and swapping stories, we worked side by side. Some still laughed when they passed, but not as often. Some just shook their heads, muttering about wasted effort. Ben didn't seem to hear them anymore, or maybe he just didn't care as much. At one point, Jacob wandered over, curiosity getting the better of him. "Dude, are you really helping him build that thing?" he asked, half incredulous, half impressed. Ben shrugged, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Yeah, why not?" Jacob smirked. "It's not even a real cabin, it's just sticks and nails." "Maybe," Ben said. Then he added, almost under his breath, "but it's ours." My chest tightened, 2 words, but they were heavier than any beam we'd lifted. By evening the frame stood taller, sturdier. We had managed to add a crossbeam that gave the whole structure a sense of shape. When we stepped back, sawdust clinging to our clothes, Ben let out a low whistle. "It actually looks like something now," he said. "It does," I agreed. "Think it'll stand?" I looked at him, "Not the cabin. It already has." He rolled his eyes again, but this time he didn't bother hiding his smile. That night, as we sat by the fire, he didn't drift off to join the other boys. He stayed near me, poking at the flames with a stick. "Tell me more about Grandpa," he said suddenly. I blinked. "What do you want to know?" "I don't know anything, what he was like." So I told him. I told him about the way my father whistled when he worked, how he could fix anything with a scrap of wire and a bit of patience. I told him about the porch again, about the crooked chair we built together, about the night we sat in silence after an argument, both too stubborn to apologize, and how he reached over and put a hand on mine anyway. Ben listened quietly, eyes on the fire. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "Sounds like he was kind of like you." I smiled faintly. "I'd take that as a compliment." Later, when the camp quieted and we crawled into our sleeping bags, he turned toward me instead of away. His voice was soft in the dark. "Dad, yeah, I don't know if I'll ever be good at this stuff, the building, the tools." "You don't have to be," I said. "You just have to try, that's enough." He was quiet a moment, then, "I'm glad you didn't stop." I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat. "Me too, son, me too." Sleep came easier that night. My hands still throbbed, my back still ached, but my heart felt lighter. For the first time, it wasn't just me building the cabin. It was us. And though the walls were only half finished, I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, that something more important had already been built. A bridge, a bond, a memory neither of us would forget. By the time the fourth day broke, the cabin was no longer a joke. Not quite a triumph, not yet, but no longer a punchline either. Where there had been only crooked beams and rope, there now stood walls. Not solid ones, not sealed against wind or rain, but enough that you could see where a door might be, where a roof might rest. The skeleton of a home. Ben and I stood back, covered in sawdust and sweat, our shirts sticking to our backs. He let out a low whistle. "It looks like a real cabin," he said, almost surprised at his own words. "It is," I replied. He smiled just briefly, then caught himself, like pride was a secret he didn't want to show too soon. The laughter hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had changed. At first it was sharp, mocking, a chorus of fathers trying to drown out what they didn't understand. Now it was quieter, more uncertain. A smirk here, a shake of the head there, the kind of laughter people use when they are not sure if they're wrong. And then, one by one, children began to drift closer. The first was a little boy, no more than 8, clutching a half-burnt marshmallow on a stick. He crept to the edge of our spot, eyes wide, and asked, "Are you really building a house?" Ben glanced at me, waiting to see how I'd answer. "Something like that," I said with a smile. "Want to see?" The boy nodded eagerly. He circled the frame, running his hand across the wood. "It's cool," he whispered almost reverently before darting back to his camp. By afternoon, more kids had gathered. They stood in a cluster, pointing, whispering, daring each other to step closer. Some did. They peppered me with questions. "Where's the kitchen? How do you make a roof? Can I help?" Their fathers called them back, uneasy. But the children came anyway, drawn not by perfection, but by the miracle of something becoming real before their eyes. I saw it happen slowly, the shift in Ben's posture. At first he had slouched, shoulders curled in on themselves, embarrassed to be near me. But as more kids crowded around, asking questions, admiring the work, he began to stand straighter. He even answered for me sometimes. "This beam's mine," he said once, patting a crooked plank he had hammered in place. "I helped with this part." The words weren't loud, but they carried enough weight to make me stop, hammer midair, just to savor them. Our cabin. Our part, our claim. That night, as the fire cracked in the center of camp, I noticed fewer fathers laughing. Some still did, quietly, but more of them just watched. One man, the same who had joked about plumbing earlier, approached me as I stoked the lantern beside our frame. "Didn't think you'd get this far," he admitted, his voice low enough not to carry. I shrugged. "Most things worth doing look impossible at first." He chuckled, but it wasn't cruel this time. It sounded almost respectful. The next morning, Ben woke before I did. I opened my eyes to see him standing at the frame, hammer in hand, tapping lightly at a nail. His face was scrunched in concentration, his tongue caught between his teeth the way it used to when he colored as a little boy. I lay still, just watching. It wasn't about the nail. It was about him choosing to lift the hammer without me asking. About him deciding this wasn't just my project anymore, it was ours. When he noticed me awake, he tried to play it off. "It was crooked," he said, shrugging. "Looked straight enough to me," I replied, smiling. He rolled his eyes, but I caught the grin he couldn't quite hide. By midday, the cabin had walls high enough to cast shade. We propped pine branches across the top beams, fashioning a roof of green needles and rough bark. It smelled like the forest itself, alive and earthy. When we stepped inside for the first time, ducking through the doorway we'd left open, Ben looked around, his eyes wide. "It feels different in here," he said. "Because it's ours," I replied. He nodded slowly, running his hand across the wall. "It's not perfect." "No," I agreed, "but it's standing." He smiled, this time without hiding it. By now, the laughter had been replaced by something else, curiosity. Fathers strolled past, pretending they were just taking a walk, but slowing down to glance at the cabin. Their eyes no longer held mockery. Some even carried the faint glint of respect they didn't yet want to admit. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The cabin spoke for itself. And so did my son's smile. That night, as the stars pricked holes in the sky, Ben and I sat inside the half-finished cabin. The lantern glowed against the rough wood, casting long shadows. "Dad," he said quietly, "do you think people will remember this?" I turned to him. "I don't know, maybe, but that's not the point." "Then what is?" I reached over, resting a hand on his shoulder. "That you will, that I will, and that's enough." He looked down, nodded once, and whispered, "Yeah, it is." By the fifth night, the cabin stood. Not polished, not perfect, but undeniable. 4 walls, a roof of pine and bark, a doorway wide enough for the two of us to duck inside. It leaned here and there, the beams weren't straight, but it held. It breathed. It was ours. Ben and I stood outside, staring at it the way you stare at something you didn't believe could exist until it did. My hands were raw, bandaged where the blisters had torn open. His fingers bore small bruises from clumsy swings of the hammer. Our clothes were streaked with dirt, our shoes stained with pine sap. And yet in that moment I don't think either of us had ever felt prouder. "It's real," he whispered. "Of course it is," I said. He touched the doorway gently, as if afraid it might vanish if he pressed too hard. When evening came, I pulled something from my duffel, a small, battered lantern. It was the same one my father used on our porch when the power went out, its glass clouded, its metal dented. I had almost left it at home, but some instinct told me to bring it. Ben eyed it curiously. Does that thing even work? Only one way to find out. We carried it inside. The air smelled of pine needles and sawdust, a raw, living scent. I struck a match, touched it to the wick, and the lantern flickered to life. Its glow spilled across the rough wood, painting the cabin walls with gold. Shadows danced long and thin, stretching into corners that hadn't existed yesterday. For the first time, our cabin wasn't just wood and nails. It was light. It was warmth. Ben sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide. It feels different in here now. Light changes everything, I said. Doesn't matter if the walls are crooked or the roof leaks. If you've got light, you've got home. He looked at me for a long time. Then quietly he said, I like it. My throat tightened. Two simple words, but heavier than anything I had carried all week. Outside, the camp had gathered by their fire. Laughter rose, but not the same kind as before. It was softer now, mingled with curiosity. One by one, people began drifting toward our cabin, lantern glow spilling through the doorway like an invitation. They stopped a few feet away, craning their necks, whispering. Children tugged at their fathers' sleeves. Some fathers folded their arms, unsure of what to say. Others simply stared, their smirks gone. One boy whispered, it's like a real house. Another asked, can we go inside? The fathers shushed them, but I caught the wonder in their eyes too. For once there was no laughter, only silence. The kind that falls when people realize something they dismissed has become something they can't ignore. I didn't say a word. I didn't boast, didn't gloat. I just sat in the doorway with my son, the lantern between us, its glow washing over our tired faces. Ben leaned back against the wall, his eyes half closed. Feels like we're the only ones here, he murmured. We kind of are, I said, because this belongs to us, no one else. He nodded, resting his chin on his knees. I'm glad we finished it. We're not finished, I corrected gently. A place like this is never finished. We'll keep adding to it one piece at a time. That's how life works too. He thought about that, then gave me a small smile. When the others finally drifted back to their tents, we stayed in our cabin. The glow of the lantern made the wooden walls seem taller, stronger. We talked quietly about school, about his friends, about things we hadn't spoken of in months. It wasn't deep. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than we'd had before. And as he lay back on his sleeping bag, staring at the lantern light flickering above him, I thought, this was it. This was the memory that would last. Not the laughter, not the embarrassment. This, a crooked cabin, a flickering lantern, a boy who finally said, I like it, and a father who had never been prouder of being different. That night, as sleep pulled at my eyes, I realized something. We hadn't just built a cabin. We had built a place inside my son's heart where my love could live, where it could stand tall even when the world outside laughed. And for me, that was more permanent than any beam or nail could ever be. I thought the cabin story would end with the lantern glow. That was enough for me and my son, a crooked set of walls and the quiet warmth of something we had built together. I didn't need more than that. But life has a way of shining light where you least expect it. The next morning, as we were tying pine branches tighter to the roofline, a woman walked into camp with a camera bag slung over her shoulder. She wore jeans and a jacket with a local news station's logo stitched on the breast pocket. A cameraman followed her, hoisting a tripod. At first I thought they were lost. What would reporters be doing at a father-son camp? Then she pointed, not at the game's field, not at the rows of neat nylon tents, but at us, at the crooked cabin standing stubborn among the pines. That's the story, she said to the cameraman. Let's set up. Within minutes, half the camp had gathered. Fathers who once chuckled now hovered at the edges, trying to act casual. Children darted closer, their excitement barely contained. Even the scout leaders, who had mostly left us alone, stood watching with raised eyebrows. The reporter approached me, smiling politely. Sir, I'm with Channel 7 News. We heard there was a father here building a cabin by hand during the weekend campout. Mind if we ask you a few questions? I hesitated, wiping sweat from my palms onto my jeans. Attention was never what I wanted. I built for my son, not for cameras. Ben stood beside me, though, eyes bright, chest lifted a little higher than usual. For once he wasn't shrinking into the background, so I nodded, sure. They asked me the usual things: why did you do this? How long did it take? What does it mean to you? I kept my answers simple. I brought tools because that's who I am. I wanted to give my son more than a weekend in a tent. I wanted to give him something we could build together. The cameraman zoomed in on my hands, the bandages still wrapped around raw skin. The reporter asked to see the inside, and we stepped through the doorway. The lantern still hung from the beam. Even in daylight, its presence gave the room a kind of quiet dignity. When the reporter turned to Ben, I expected him to shrink back. Instead, he straightened his shoulders. "My dad built this," he said. His voice cracked just slightly, but he didn't stop. Everyone laughed at first, but he didn't quit. And I helped too. The cameraman caught it all, the shy pride in his eyes, the way his fingers traced the beam he'd hammered. I felt my throat tighten. That was the story. Not me, not the wood, him. When the interview ended, the cabin was no longer just ours. It belonged in some strange way to everyone who had laughed and now stood silent. Fathers stepped forward, offering awkward nods. "Didn't think you'd pull it off," one admitted. "Looks solid." Another clapped me on the back. "My boy hasn't stopped talking about it, says he wishes we'd built something too." Children swarmed the doorway, peeking in, marveling at the rough-hewn walls like it was a castle. Their wonder was real, unfiltered. But through it all, I kept my eyes on Ben, because he wasn't embarrassed anymore. He was smiling, genuine, wide, unashamed. When Jacob came over and said, "Dude, this is actually awesome," Ben didn't look away. He stood taller. "Yeah," he said simply, "it is." That evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, the reporter and cameraman packed up. "We'll run this story tonight," she told me. "People could use a reminder of what fathers and sons can do together." I thanked her politely, though I wasn't sure what to feel. Fame wasn't what I wanted. Attention wasn't the point. Later, as the campfire crackled and kids toasted marshmallows, fathers asked me questions: what tools I'd used, how long it had taken, if I'd been a carpenter by trade. I answered as best I could, but my mind wasn't on them. It was on the boy sitting beside me, sticky marshmallow on his fingers, shoulders relaxed, a quiet pride in his face. For the first time, I didn't feel like an embarrassment to him. I felt like his father again. That night back in the cabin, Ben lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the lantern glow. He was quiet a long time before speaking. "Dad." "Yes, I think I get it now." "Get what?" "Why you didn't stop, why you kept going even when everyone laughed." I waited, my heart still. "Because it wasn't about them," he said. "It was about me, about us." I closed my eyes, letting the words sink deep. "That's right." He turned on his side, facing me. "Thanks, Dad." For a moment I couldn't speak. I just reached across the space between us, resting my hand on his arm. "Always," I whispered. The cabin wasn't perfect. It would never win awards for architecture. Its walls would eventually fall back into the earth. But what we built inside it, that would last. The laughter had faded. The respect of strangers had arrived. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that my son finally saw me. And in his eyes, for the first time in a long time, I was enough. The last night of camp arrived with a sky clear as glass. Stars hung like nails driven into a black plank, steady and unshakable. The air was cool, carrying the smell of smoke and pine. Most fathers gathered at the fire one final time, trading phone numbers, making plans to meet again. Their laughter was warm now, not sharp. But Ben and I didn't join them. We sat inside the cabin, our cabin. The lantern glowed between us, its light bouncing off rough boards, making them look richer than they really were. The pine branches above us rustled whenever the wind passed through, whispering like an old song. Ben lay on his sleeping bag, arms folded under his head, staring at the ceiling. I sat with my back against the wall, legs stretched, listening to his breathing and the faint creak of the wood settling. For a long time, neither of us spoke. And for once, the silence wasn't heavy. It was comfortable. Finally, he broke it. "I can't believe we did it." "We did," I said. "It's not perfect." "No," I agreed, "but nothing worth keeping ever is." He smiled faintly, eyes still on the ceiling. When the kids were looking at it today, when Jacob said it was cool, I felt different. How so? Like I wasn't embarrassed anymore, like I was proud. I studied his face, the way the lantern light softened his features. He wasn't the little boy who once held my hand at the park. He wasn't quite the man he would become. He was something in between, halfway built like the cabin itself. That's the thing about building, I said quietly. It takes time, it takes mistakes. It takes people laughing at you because they can't see the end yet. But when you stick with it, even through the blisters and the doubt, one day you look around and realize you've made something that lasts. His eyes met mine. For once, he didn't look away. Later, as the camp grew quiet, he asked about my father again. What do you think Grandpa would say if he saw this? I swallowed, my throat tight. He'd probably laugh too, but not the way they did. He'd laugh because he'd understand. He'd say, "Took you long enough." Ben chuckled softly, then grew serious. I wish I remembered him. You remember him through me, I said, and maybe one day your son will remember me through you. He nodded slowly, as if tucking the thought into a pocket he'd carry for later. When the lantern finally burned low, we lay in the glow until sleep pulled us under. The cabin creaked around us, imperfect, unfinished, but strong enough to hold two people who had been further apart than either wanted to admit. I dreamt of porches and crooked chairs, of laughter that no longer hurt, of a boy becoming a man beneath a roof we'd built with our own hands. The next morning, we packed our things. Most families rolled up their tents in minutes, neat and quick. We took longer. Taking down a cabin, even a temporary one, wasn't easy. Ben stood by me as we dismantled the beams, stacking wood carefully. His hands were blistered too, but he didn't complain. As we loaded the last pieces into the truck, he turned to me. "Do you think people will forget about it?" "Maybe," I said, "but we won't." He nodded. "Good, because I don't want to." And in his voice I heard the truth. We had built more than walls. We had built a memory, a bridge, a home that would live inside him long after the last nail was pulled. Driving away from camp, the cabin now just pieces of wood in the back, I glanced at my son. He wasn't looking out the window this time. He wasn't hiding behind earbuds. He was sitting upright, staring straight ahead, a quiet pride in his face. "Dad," he said suddenly, "thanks for not giving up." I tightened my grip on the wheel, blinking hard. "Always, son, always." And that's the story. They laughed when I brought tools to the father-son camp. They mocked, they whispered, they called me old-fashioned, crazy. But in the end, what I built wasn't just a cabin. It was a place where my son and I met again after years of distance. A place where his embarrassment turned into pride. A place where he could finally say, "That's ours." And maybe one day when he's older, he'll build something of his own, not because the world approves, but because love taught him how. To those of you who have listened all the way through, thank you. Maybe you've been laughed at for the way you love, or for holding on to something others call old-fashioned. Maybe you've carried tools when the world thought you should carry something shinier. Don't stop. Because the things we build with our hands and with our hearts are the things that outlast the laughter. From me to you, I wish you health and strength and family to share it with. May you always have a place, however crooked, to call your own. Thank you for listening to my story.